What happens when a Hollywood legend refuses to play by the rules of modern television? The answer came on a night when millions of viewers expected a light-hearted interview, a few nostalgic anecdotes, and the same effortless charm late-night TV has served for decades. But within minutes, the atmosphere inside ABC's studio in Hollywood shifted. In less than 20 minutes, a comedy show would transform into a battlefield. The audience had arrived eager for laughter. They wanted to see Harrison Ford, the man who flew the Millennium Falcon, cracked Indiana Jones's whip, and carried an entire generation's cinematic dreams on his shoulders. At 81, Ford was supposed to smile, tell a couple of war stories from the set, and maybe throw in a self-deprecating joke about aging. Instead, he would deliver something far more explosive. Jimmy Kimmel, the veteran host with a razor-sharp grin and a knack for keeping conversations smooth, thought he was in control. For 2 decades, he had turned tense topics into punchlines, uncomfortable silences into applause breaks. But this wasn't going to be another neatly packaged segment. He was about to push a man who had built his career, not on pleasing crowds, but on commanding them. And that was the moment everything changed. Ford wasn't here to promote his film in the usual way. He wasn't here to stroke the ego of late-night TV or play the game of manufactured sound bites. He came carrying something heavier than promotion, something personal, something unflinching. The silence that would fall upon that studio wasn't scripted. The confrontation that would unfold wasn't part of any segment rundown. And when Ford finally stood up and walked off set, the world witnessed not just a guest leaving an interview but a cultural collision. The clash of old Hollywood grit against new Hollywood politics, raw authenticity against rehearsed morality. The legend refused to play along, and late-night television would never look the same. The night began like any other episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live. A buzzing studio audience packed into the familiar late-night set, their laughter and chatter forming a nervous hum under the stage lights. The band played its brassy riffs. Cameras rolled in practiced arcs, and producers behind the glass nodded with satisfaction. Everything was set for another night of laughter and easy entertainment. Then he walked in, Harrison Ford. At 81 years old, he carried himself with a presence that silenced even the most distracted fans in the audience. Time had etched lines into his face, but his stoic demeanor remained unshaken. Every step he took onto that stage carried the weight of a man who had lived through more than half a century in Hollywood's trenches. He didn't need to smile to command respect. He just needed to be. Jimmy Kimmel, perched behind his desk, knew the assignment well. His grin was wide, his voice booming with enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen, the man, the myth, the legend Harrison Ford," he declared, the crowd exploding in applause. It was a classic Kimmel moment, hype humor, and a little reverence, all neatly wrapped in his signature showmanship. Ford gave the audience a small nod. Nothing flashy, nothing exaggerated, just enough to acknowledge them before sinking into the guest chair. The contrast was immediate. Kimmel radiated charm, constantly in motion, while Ford sat still, understated, like a monolith against a storm. The first few minutes unfolded smoothly. Kimmel played to Ford's history, asking about his latest film project. Ford obliged with clipped but polite answers. They exchanged light-hearted banter about working with directors, about the old injuries Ford had famously accumulated on set. Each story landed with a familiar rhythm, the audience chuckling, Kimmel tossing in a punchline, Ford delivering his trademark growly voice that carried the weight of lived experience. The air was warm, comfortable, familiar. It was late-night television as it had always been. But beneath the surface, something was off. There was a subtle sharpness in Ford's eyes, a glint that didn't match the casual banter. When Kimmel laughed, Ford didn't always laugh back. When the audience roared, Ford seemed to let it wash over him, detached, almost analytical. He wasn't basking in the glow of nostalgia or leaning into the easy comfort of celebrity. He was waiting. The audience didn't sense it yet, lulled into the safety of routine. Kimmel didn't see it yet, confident in his ability to guide any guest down the path of laughter and applause. But Ford, he knew this wasn't going to be just another promotional appearance. This wasn't going to be just another charming night on late-night TV. Harrison Ford wasn't here to play along. The rhythm of the interview began to change. Up until this moment, Jimmy Kimmel had kept the tone light, tossing out stories and jokes with the ease of a man who had done this thousands of times before. But then his grin shifted, less playful, more deliberate. He leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing just slightly, and asked the question that would ignite the night. "You know," Harrison Kimmel began, voice deceptively casual, "you've been in this business for over 5 decades. You've seen Hollywood change. What do you think about the way the industry handles controversial figures these days?" The words dropped into the studio like a stone into still water. The atmosphere rippled instantly. Ford didn't move at first. He sat in silence, jaw-tight, hands resting on the arms of his chair. But the subtle shift was undeniable. His fingers curled slightly, gripping the wood as though anchoring himself. His eyes, shadowed by the stage lights, hardened. "What do you mean by that, Jimmy?" His voice was low, even, but there was steel beneath it. Kimmel leaned forward, sensing the shift. "Well, we've seen actors, directors, celebrities, people facing consequences for things they've said or done. Some call it accountability, others call it cancel culture. You've never been shy about speaking your mind. Do you ever worry about saying the wrong thing?" The question hung in the air, too long. The audience, still holding smiles from the earlier jokes, froze. A few shifted in their seats, as if instinctively aware the temperature in the room had just risen. Ford's grip tightened, his gaze locked on Kimmel, unblinking, and then he spoke. "I think people should be able to express their opinions," he said carefully. Each word weighted without fear of having their careers destroyed by a mob mentality. The reaction was immediate but not vocal. No laughs, no applause, just silence, a heavy, unsettling silence that rolled across the room. Kimmel's eyebrows rose slightly, his grin taking on a sharper edge. He sensed an opening, the possibility of a viral moment. "That's interesting," he pressed, his tone still wrapped in showman's charm, but edged with something harder. "So you think some of the people who face consequences didn't deserve it? Because we're not just talking about unpopular opinions, Harrison. Some of these cases involve serious allegations." The words were deliberate, loaded. Ford shifted in his chair, leaning forward ever so slightly. His voice dropped lower, his grayly tone carrying a quiet intensity that filled the space. "I'm talking about the principle, Jimmy," he said, measured but firm. "There's a difference between holding people accountable for genuine wrongdoing and destroying someone's livelihood because they made a mistake years ago or because their opinion doesn't fit the popular narrative." The studio was no longer an audience enjoying a comedy show. It was a courtroom, a battleground. Every eye was locked on the two men at center stage. And in that instant, the interview transformed. This wasn't late-night entertainment anymore. This was the spark. The first shot fired in a war of words that would burn hotter and louder with every exchange. The pleasantries were gone. The real fight had just begun. The silence hung thick in the studio like smoke after an explosion. Jimmy Kimmel's trademark grin flickered, no longer playful. It carried a trace of unease, as though he realized his guest wasn't going to give him the easy viral soundbite he'd been fishing for. Still, he pressed forward, leaning into his desk like a man determined to hold his ground. "But Harrison," he said, voice firmer now, "don't you think actors and celebrities, people in positions of influence, have a responsibility to be careful about what they say, especially when it comes to sensitive topics?" Ford's eyes narrowed. His voice was steady, but the undercurrent of steel was unmistakable. "Careful? According to who?" His grelly tone cut through the quiet like a blade. "You, the Twitter mob, some corporate boardroom, or maybe an algorithm written by 20 programmers in Silicon Valley?" The question landed like a punch. The audience, which had been chuckling along moments earlier, fell dead silent. A few people shifted in their seats, uneasy, as if they'd wandered into a conversation they weren't supposed to witness. Behind the cameras, producers exchanged nervous glances. Someone in the control room muttered about cutting to commercial, but the red light above the cameras stayed on. The show was still live, and every second of this was being broadcast to millions. Kimmel's smile thinned, his tone sharpened. "I wouldn't call it a Twitter mob," he countered. "I'd call it accountability. When people use their platform to spread harmful ideologies, there have to be consequences." Ford leaned forward, his frame casting a shadow across the desk. "And who decides what qualifies as harmful, Jimmy? Who gets to sit in judgment? You, the network executives, or is it talk show hosts pretending they're arbiters of morality?" The words hit like thunder. Kimmel's practiced composure wavered for the briefest moment before he steadied himself, voice tightening. "I think most reasonable people can recognize hate speech when they see it. Harrison, we're not talking about philosophy here. We're talking about basic human decency." Ford's laugh was low, humorless, the kind that made the hair on the back of the neck stand up. Basic human decency. That's a convenient phrase, isn't it? Broad enough to mean whatever you want it to mean. Useful enough to shut down any argument you don't like. The tension was no longer invisible. It was tangible. It vibrated in the air, charged like static before a lightning strike. Camera operators zoomed in tighter, instinctively sensing this was no ordinary interview. The atmosphere was electric, combustible, as if the studio itself had become a powder keg waiting for a spark. Kimmel's jaw tightened, his voice rose slightly, his entertainer's mask slipping away. "Look, we can all agree that racism, sexism, and bigotry are wrong. When public figures promote those things, they should face consequences. That's not controversial. That's common sense." Ford's voice cut in before he finished, sharp and decisive. "There you go again, defining the terms of the debate so they always work in your favor." The words sliced through the studio air. Kimmel's face flushed red. His usual rhythm setup joke, applause was gone. This was something different. This was combat. "I'm not defining anything," Kimmel shot back. "I'm pointing out that harmful behavior deserves pushback. That's how society works." Ford straightened, his expression darkening. His growly voice carried across the studio with deadly clarity. "Society? Or is it just your corner of Hollywood? Because where I come from, society isn't defined by groupthink in a Malibu mansion or some boardroom decision about who's acceptable this week." The audience gasped softly. They were no longer watching a celebrity interview. They were witnessing a duel. Kimmel's hands clenched on his desk, his eyes locked on Ford's, his voice rising. "That's rich coming from someone who's made millions, playing heroes who solve problems with violence. Maybe you're just uncomfortable with the idea that the real world requires more nuance than your movies." Ford's eyes flashed dangerously. His voice was low, deadly calm. "Don't lecture me about nuance, Jimmy. And don't pretend that what you're doing here is anything more than performance art. You reduce complex issues to punchlines. You build divisions where there could be understanding. You make your audience feel superior to people they've never even met. The words landed like blows. Kimmel leaned forward, his voice cracking under the pressure. I'm trying to have real conversations, honest ones. Maybe that makes you uncomfortable, Harrison. Maybe you've spent so long hiding behind characters that you don't know how to handle the truth anymore. Ford rose slightly in his chair, looming. Hiding behind characters, he repeated, his voice dark with fury. At least when I play a character, I'm honest about it. I don't sit behind a desk every night pretending to be some moral authority. The audience sat frozen. No applause, no laughter, just the hum of the cameras and the growing sense that they were watching something historic. Two men, two philosophies, two worlds locked in a standoff as old as Hollywood itself. And the heat in that studio was still climbing. The air in the studio was no longer just tense, it was suffocating. The laughter had evaporated, replaced by a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on everyone in the room. And then the moment came. Harrison Ford pushed himself up from the chair. Slowly, deliberately, his 6-foot frame rose like a storm front, gathering strength, casting a long shadow over Jimmy Kimmel's desk. His eyes blazed with the same legendary intensity that had once frozen audiences in theaters when Han Solo stared down Darth Vader, or when Indiana Jones faced death with nothing but a whip and courage. For a second the world seemed to hold its breath. Kimmel, perhaps unwilling to be dwarfed, stood as well. He straightened his jacket, forcing his voice into something firm, though it cracked at the edges. You know what, Harrison? You're just another privileged Hollywood elite defending bigotry because it doesn't touch you. You represent everything wrong with old Hollywood. The words rang out like an accusation in a courtroom, sharp and damning. But Ford didn't flinch. His lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, so quiet the microphones had to lean into his gravel. But every word carried like thunder. Old Hollywood, he repeated slowly, tasting the phrase like it was poison. Let me tell you something about old Hollywood, Jimmy. We made art, not propaganda. We told stories, not sermons. We respected our audiences. We didn't lecture them. We trusted them to think for themselves. The audience was transfixed. No one moved. Even the camera operators, usually trained to stay invisible, were locked on their viewfinders, hands trembling as they realized they were capturing history in the making. Kimmel's face flushed, his fist tightened on the desk, knuckles whitening. Art, respect. Don't kid yourself, Harrison. You've spent your career cashing in on fantasy, pretending to be a hero while the real world moved on without you. You're just an actor who got rich playing pretend. The insult hit hard, but Ford's reaction was colder than fire. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and the desk, towering over the host, his voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. When this ends, Jimmy, Ford said, eyes locked onto Kimmel's with the unblinking focus of a predator. I'll go home and sleep peacefully knowing I live my life with integrity. Can you say the same? The words landed with the force of a physical blow. Kimmel opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His polished composure, the shield he had worn for years in front of live audiences, cracked wide open. His eyes darted, searching the crowd, the cameras anywhere for escape, but there was none. Ford pressed on. I've spent 50 years earning the trust of audiences, he said, his voice rising now, each word a hammer blow. I've risked my life, put my body on the line, broken bones to give them something real, something honest. And what do, Jimmy? You sit behind that desk every night, passing judgment, turning complex issues into punchlines, tearing people down so your audience can feel superior for 10 seconds before the next commercial break. Each sentence struck harder than the last. Kimmel's face went pale, his bravado stripped away. He tried to interject, but Ford cut across him with the precision of a blade. You call it accountability? Ford snarled. But what it really is, what you really do is destroy. Destroy reputations, destroy careers, destroy discourse, because it makes for good television. The audience sat frozen, every eye darting between the two men like tennis spectators at the final rally of a championship. But this wasn't a game. This was a duel. Kimmel tried once more to regain footing, his voice rising in desperation. I use my platform to fight for what's right, to call out hatred, to give a voice to the voiceless. That's more than hiding behind movie roles and staying silent when it matters. Ford's laugh was sharp and humorless. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, his voice now filling every inch of the studio. Staying silent. Don't you dare lecture me about silence. I've fought my battles in the real world long before you ever sat behind this desk. I've seen real oppression, real consequences, and I've done it without needing applause or validation from a crowd. Kimmel faltered, his face wreathing to near purple, veins bulging at his temples. He tried again. You think because you've lived longer? Because you've played heroes that makes you some authority on moral courage? You're just an old man clinging to a past that doesn't exist anymore? For a heartbeat, Ford went still. Then he leaned down over the desk, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. You want to know the difference between us, Jimmy, he said, his eyes burning with controlled fury. I don't need to destroy others to feel important. I don't need to paint everyone who disagrees with me as a monster to win an argument. Real strength isn't tearing people down. It's building them up, and that's something you'll never understand. Kimmel froze, his mouth open but words failing him. The mask was gone. The confident host had vanished, replaced by a man exposed vulnerable, drowning in the glare of the cameras. Ford straightened his jacket, every movement deliberate, like a man reclaiming absolute control. He turned briefly to the audience, his voice carrying to every corner of the studio. "You came here for entertainment?" he said. "Not a lecture, not another sermon about how broken the world is. And the fault for this lies with people who confuse celebrity with wisdom." The silence was deafening. This wasn't television anymore. This wasn't scripted, rehearsed, or polished. This was raw. This was real. And it was the legendary showdown moment. The duel everyone would remember. The room was paralyzed. No laughter, no applause, not even the shuffle of feet. Just silence, heavy and absolute, pressing down like a weight. Harrison Ford stood tall, the storm still burning in his eyes. But his movements were calm now, controlled, deliberate. With a slow breath, he adjusted his jacket, every motion radiating dignity. Then he turned toward the audience, his voice steady but resonant, carrying the authority of a man who had nothing left to prove. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, gravel in his tone, but a softness beneath it. "You came here tonight for entertainment, not to sit through lectures, not to be caught in someone else's crusade, and the fault for that lies with those who confuse celebrity with wisdom." A ripple of unease spread through the audience. No one dared clap, no one dared laugh, they simply stared, transfixed by the rare honesty crackling in the air. Ford turned toward the wings, his footsteps echoing through the silent studio as he started for the exit. It was the sound of finality of a man done playing the game. Behind him, Jimmy Kimmel broke. His voice cracked as he called out desperately, "Harrison, wait, we can work this out." Ford paused at the edge of the stage. Slowly, he looked back over his shoulder. His expression was not angry now, but filled with something deeper, something heavier. Disappointment. "No, Jimmy," he said quietly, his words slicing sharper than any shouted insult. "Because working it out requires listening, and you've forgotten how to do that." The words hung in the air like a verdict. No one moved. Not the crew, not the cameras, not the audience. Then Ford disappeared into the wings, leaving behind only the echo of his departure. Kimmel stood frozen at his desk, pale and hollow-eyed, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound escaping. The once commanding host now looked like a man who had been hit by a freight train, stripped of his armor in front of millions. The silence remained thick and suffocating. For the first time in his career, Jimmy Kimmel had no comeback and Harrison Ford was gone. For a moment after Ford's departure, the studio remained frozen in stunned silence. Then the murmurs began low, nervous at first, then growing louder as the audience tried to process what they had just witnessed. Some clutched their phones under their jackets, secretly recording in defiance of the no-footage policy. Security moved quickly, confiscating devices where they could. But it was too late. The moment had already escaped into the world. Within hours, shaky clips surfaced online, spreading across social media like wildfire. Hashtags trended globally. Comment sections exploded. Half the internet hailed Ford as a hero who had spoken uncomfortable truths. The other half called it a meltdown. Either way, no one could look away. By morning, mainstream outlets were replaying the footage on loop, dissecting every glare, every pause, every razor-edged word. The confrontation wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was a cultural flashpoint. Days later, the fallout was undeniable. Kimmel's ratings plummeted. Viewers turning away in droves, accusing him of being mean-spirited, out of touch, and blinded by his own self-importance. For the first time in years, his hold on late-night television looked fragile. Harrison Ford, on the other hand, emerged unscathed. More than that, he was elevated. That night cemented his image not just as a Hollywood legend, but as an uncompromising truth-teller, a man unwilling to bend to the tides of modern outrage. At 81, he had nothing left to prove, and yet he had proven something anyway. For Kimmel, it was a humiliation, a hard lesson in the difference between wielding media power and earning respect. For Ford, it was a legacy-defining stand. They came for entertainment. Instead, they witnessed television